So just to introduce myself first, my name is Jack Wood. I work in the strategy team at Homes England as a senior strategy analyst, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you to the session today as part of the 2023 Summer Learning Programme. This is part of a series of knowledge sharing sessions on the topics that you've said are of interest to you. So as many of you might be aware, Homes England published its new 5-year strategic plan in May earlier this year. This slide on the screen currently just shows our mission as set out within the plan, and this really sits at the center of everything that we do as an agency. So I'll just leave that there for 2 seconds. And then if we could move to the next slide, please. So looking at our strategic objectives, we have 5 interconnected strategic objectives, which you can see on the screen now at the minute, each coming with its own key performance indicators for how we'll measure our performance over the course of the plan's period. The plan is available on the gov.uk website, so I'd encourage anybody who is interested to please check this out following the session. Next slide, please. Today's session is brought to you by the Homes England Local Government Capacity Centre, and this slide sets out who they are and what they do. So the Local Government Capacity Centre develop, curate and design well-structured, accessible offers for local government and their partners to increase capacity and skills, drive regeneration and housing delivery, and create a high-quality home and thriving places. We established a centre following extensive research and consultation with yourselves across local government and with a whole range of other partners to determine where authorities need the most support and how this could be delivered. Whilst these sessions are designed for local government, we're really pleased today to be able to bring these and open these up to housing association partners as well. And we look forward to hearing how we did at the survey poll at the end of the session. Just move on to the next slide, please. So looking at the agenda for today's session, during the call today, we'll be hearing from speakers from Karbon Homes and Metro Dynamics, who will be introducing the Fair Foundation's approach and the underpinning research into how investing in far-reaching, place-based interventions can aim to improve the foundational economy and tackle deep-seated issues in areas. On the slide, you'll see a breakdown of today's sessions. So we'll be starting off with an introduction to Karbon Homes, then providing an overview of the research done by Metro Dynamics on place-based interventions, and finally looking at what actions are currently being taken following the researchers' findings. We'll then be going into our Q&A section, covering some of the most popular questions from the chat before drawing the session to a close with our take-home messages and feedback polls. So please do continue to pop these questions into the chat as we go. The session is approximately 90 minutes long, and during the session, please feel welcome to stand up, get a drink, and take any comfort breaks that you require. And after we're finished today, we will be sharing a copy of the slide deck with the registered attendees as well for your reflections later on. Next slide, please. Great. So I'm now going to hand over to our first presenter, Dr. Charlotte Carpenter, Executive Director of Growth and Business Development at Karbon Homes. Thank you, and over to yourself, Charlotte.
Thanks very much, Jack, and hello everyone. It's great to be here with you today. So for those of you that don't know us, Karbon Homes is a housing association. We're based in Newcastle and we operate across the northeastern Yorkshire. We've got about 33,000 homes that we own and manage. Next slide, please. And this slide here gives our mission, which is pretty similar to most organisations within the sector. So to provide as many good qualities homes as we can, we do that through strategic asset management, but also development. So we are a Homes England strategic partner, and we build between 600 and 700 homes a year. Secondly, to deliver excellent services to our customers. And third, to shape strong, sustainable places for our communities. So Karbon was formed through a merger about 6 years ago, and those 3 strategic aims were put in place at that time, along with our first strategy. When we came to refresh that 3 years later, we decided to, in particular, focus on the third aim around shaping strong, sustainable places for our communities, because we felt that that was the area of our work where we were most lacking a clear conceptual framework. And with that lack, we were really struggling. We knew that we had a role in intervening in places, but beyond building homes and offering our housing services and some additional add-on services, we weren't clear what sort of interventions were likely to make the biggest sustainable impact in places, and so what we should be prioritising and where. It was seeking to answer that question that really set us off on our journey to the development of our Fair Foundations approach. And this session is going to particularly focus on the first piece of work in that journey, and that's work that we did with Metro Dynamics. Next slide, please. So what you can see here is a map of our footprint in areas that we operate. You'll recognise areas in that map, such as York, that you will know on the whole are relatively prosperous with functioning housing market economies. If anything, the issues in those areas will be excess market demand rather than too low. But equally, there are a number of areas within our geography that could be characterised as being left behind or areas of multiple deprivation. And it was really those areas where we felt we were most lacking a clear conceptual framework of an approach. And I think it's fair to say that the disparity that we see in that respect is not only within our region, but it's within specific places. Next slide, please. So this slide really sort of brings home the underlying motivation behind our Fair Foundation approach. Gosforth and Biker are both areas within Newcastle. So Gosforth is a sort of a relatively central suburban area. It's relatively affluent by northeast standards, not astoundingly so, but it's one of the better off areas within Newcastle. Biker, by contrast, you may have heard of Biker from the famous through the Biker Wall and also Biker Grove. That's a very different area. It's also relatively central. It's more urban, less suburban, and it's significantly more deprived. I think it's fair to say that it's an area with many strengths. It's very close to a very creative area. It's one of the more diverse areas within the Newcastle and North East region. But you can see from this is also an area that suffers from a number of challenges around multiple deprivation. And that's very much impacts on people's life chances and even life expectancy. So you'll see from this, the life expectancy in Biker, which is only a couple of miles down the road from Gosforth, is around 12 years less, and rates of poverty and benefit claimants are around 10 times more those within Gosforth. And I think that a number of areas have that sort of disparity. So it was areas like Biker. Actually, it was more specifically an area in County Durham called Stanley that really we wanted to sort of think about and focus on how we might be able to make a bigger and more sustainable difference in those areas. Next slide, please. So we, as per our mission, we always felt that our role went beyond the provision of affordable housing and the delivery of rental housing services. Like most other housing associations, we already did offered ancillary services. That would be services like benefit support and advice, some training, that sort of thing. And quite a lot of work that I would probably characterise as sort of poverty alleviation rather than sort of economic development intervention. But we felt that as an anchor institution, so that's to say an organisation that is rooted sort of long term within an area. We business plan over 20, 30 years. Most of our homes we would intend to keep for at least that long. We're a very significant local employer. We've got a fundamental interest, not only through our vision, but also as a business in the longer term sustainability and health of an area. But as I said, we needed a more holistic approach to place with a strategic framework, and we were looking to that to help us prioritise our place interventions. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, what we did was we identified a pilot area, which, as I said, was Stanley in County Durham. So Stanley is an ex-mining village. It is an area that was once relatively prosperous and successful when the mines were open, but has since the closure of mines has continued to suffer decline, and it's an area that is broadly within the red wall area, if that helps to characterize it and you understand some of the dynamics at play within that area. And I think the other significant thing for us to say about Stanley, just to give you an idea of the scale of our presence as an anchor institution, is that Karbon Homes owns 1 in 4 of every home within the Stanley town. So we're a significant landlord within that area, and we're the biggest single landlord in that area. So what we decided to do was to commission Metro Dynamics to do a piece of work that would focus specifically on Stanley, but in doing so would also help develop a sort of conceptual framework and approach for us to then adapt and utilise in other areas as well. So we asked them to help us understand in detail different ways that we have an impact on our communities, to help us move beyond activity-based measures of economic and social impact, because instead we wanted to be looking at outcome-based measurement and areas of success, and then consider what that means for the direction for further investment and intervention. And I'm now going to hand over to Patrick, who's going to talk through the work that we did for
Thanks very much, Charlotte, and thanks very much, Jack, for a great intro. Thanks for having us today. As Charlotte said, we've been working with Karbon to really try and understand what goes on in Stanley and the impact that they have and the impact that they can have. Metro Dynamics is a 30-strong team of people. We're owned by a trust on behalf of all current and future employees. So we're kind of as close to a think tank as it's possible to get. And we've been going for about 8 years, and we set ourselves up because we're really interested in how you get maximum impact from capital investment in places, and how do you really understand the wiring that enables you to do that, and how do you move away from an assumption that outcomes, economic outcomes make a difference to really getting the wiring better. So that's what we do. We run some networks. We run an inclusive growth network with a Centre for Progressive Policy that does some of that. And we work in a range of cities and places with different kind of anchor institutions all over the country. What we wanted to do here, and what I was going to take you through, was an approach that starts by looking at place, then tries to unpack what's actually happening to people's incomes in that place and the impact of housing on their incomes, and then tries to use that to really understand how Karbon could make a difference and what they might actually do. So I'm going to kind of start up here with the place, come down into some data, and then come back out and talk about what we found that meant in terms of how Karbon could identify the things that they could most usefully do. At a high level, we needed to understand the data and what was available. And those of you who work in towns and think about data in towns will know that data is not always kind of what we needed to be. So think really hard about data. Think really hard about who was working in Stanley, what the kind of stakeholders were, and then to really go and talk to people to understand in as much detail as possible, and to fill in the kind of qualitative gaps where there were kind of, where the quantitative evidence wasn't, if you like, to really understand what was going on and what the foundational economy was here and how we could make a difference to it. So next slide, please. So we start where we always start, which is with the data, and we effectively went to look at the different component parts of how you understand a town like Stanley, how you understand a place, where there are data sets and where there aren't, and it won't come as much surprise to you to know that we kind of have some town overview stats, and then we kind of chunked our data availability into kind of business and employment, people, and kind of infrastructure, and then went off to find all the kind of data sets that are available and to work out how we kind of overlay them and draw comparators and things across all of those. So it's really just a summary of the kind of data sets that we're looking at. And the important thing here is to really understand the reality of what's going on with people's economic situation on a kind of day-to-day basis. If our hypothesis is to try and move beyond kind of assumed outcomes and an assumed outcome link between an intervention and kind of actual lived experience, then you've really got to understand the actual money flows and the actual kind of what the actual data is telling you about what is having an impact on people's lives and how is it having an impact. Next slide. So this slide shows two things. The first on the left is just having had a look at the data, we then started to think about, well, who is in this system, literally, who is working in Stanley, and what are they working on, and what are they living, and what are they doing. So we identified a whole different sets of groups of stakeholders, and then we started to think about the table on the right, which says what is the foundational economy in a place like Stanley? What's actually going on here? So the left-hand column talks about identifies the different areas of the economy. What are the things that actually have an impact on people's kind of day-to-day economic life? And then the next column says, okay, if we've identified things like health and care, things like banks, things like law and order, things like leisure, as well as utilities, what are the actual institutions? What are the kind of actors in these different kind of parts of the economy? And can we be really clear about what they are and what their nature is? So what have you got? You've got hospitals, you've got power stations, you've got police stations, you've got schools, you've got FE colleges, you've got housing associations, supermarkets. There's a bunch of stuff that actually happens, a bunch of institutions, organizations, and sites that do stuff in Stanley. And then you say, okay, next column, what's the relevance to the foundational economy here and to our understanding of actual income? And how do we kind of try and isolate and try and identify the actual actors and the actual institutions and bits of a place that have most impact on individuals' kind of real income? And then we said, okay, and to what extent are those actors present and having an impact in Stanley? So we can narrow it down a bit more, and that's what the final column does. And next slide, please. And then we said, okay, let's have a look at this thing called residual household income. And residual household income is a measure of a household's gross income minus some deductions around essential expenditure. So taxes, housing, utilities, and transport, we take these things off. And having taken them off, that gives us a sense of the actual residual income that people have left. It's different than disposable income because disposable income accounts for property and other things like kind of tax and loans, but it doesn't factor in the kind of basic cost of living. And of course, basic cost of living are kind of non-negotiable. They are what they are. And if we really want to understand residual incomes, what people have left over, and therefore the things that they're committed to, we have to get a feel for a bigger basket, if you like, of kind of non-discretionary, non-negotiable kind of payments. So what we do is we group those up, take them away from gross income, and we see what the kind of impact is. And what the chart on the right shows is the dark blue columns shows the weekly kind of household income, and then the grey bar shows residual household income. So what happens when you take away this slightly larger basket of non-discretionary kind of payments? And they're separate. They're shown by tenure mix, and you've got actual pounds income and then percentages as well. And the yellow box shows the percentage of income that people are spending on housing, fuel, and transport, those kind of non-discretionary items for different tenure mixes. And you can see straight away an obvious point about people, essentially who usually have lower incomes and are renting, spend a greater proportion of their income on non-discretionary things. But there's a very, very big difference between private rented and social rented. And this starts to get us into, where you target activity and what it might mean in a place like Stanley. And some of what that slide shows are things which are kind of, if you like, common knowledge to us. But some of just how big a difference these non-discretionary things make to you if you're in rented, and particularly if we're in private rented sector in the UK, is really quite important. Next slide, please. And then we started to look at it in a bit more detail. This is a Data Geeks slide, so no apologies for that. I'm not going to explain all of it, don't worry. But what it does is to take this residual household income measure and then say, okay, if we look at the UK, what do we know about the weekly expenditure that exists for people, that people have left as a proportion of their income, and what do we know about that by tenure? And we know from the slide I've just shown that a higher proportion generally going on housing, fuel and transport in social rented and private rented in the UK. And then we looked at Stanley, and if you look at the right hand kind of 4 columns, you see what's going on in Stanley, and you can see that this housing, fuel, power, these are the things which people spend, by a significant margin, by kind of, that is over twice, the amount of money that the percentage of income that people are spending compared to things they're spending on anything else. Even food is only 9%. So actually, this is if you're thinking about what do I want to influence here, how do I want to help people, then the big red boxes are the things to look at, essentially. So these 17% food, transport, as we've said as we're seeing in the chat, one of the things that came out of this work was actually childcare, and how do we think about childcare and how do we tackle childcare. And I'll say more about that, I think, a little later on in the presentation. But essentially, you look at this and you go, okay, if I really want to make a difference here, then I need to think about how I get at that kind of 17%. What do I do that kind of focuses down on this aspect of people's income and what they're spending it on? So next slide, please. So we use logic models a lot, and logic models have an advantage in when you're trying to link data to action. But one of the things we really wanted to try and do here was to be really focused about how we identify actions which carbon can genuinely do, which are genuinely going to make a difference. So I'll talk a bit more about how we prioritize them in the future. But the aim of this kind of approach is to really try and get to a detail, not just of a kind of theoretical intervention or an action that could make a difference, but to narrow it down to the things which you actually are able to have agency over as an organization or as a place. Could be a housing association, could be a local authority, could be combined authority. This will be different depending on kind of who you are and what you're trying to do. But essentially, what are the things which we can do which would make a difference? So we use the data, which I've just kind of summarized a little bit to talk through the challenges and the opportunities. We looked at the rationale here. What's carbon for? What's its kind of mission? Why should it act? What does the data tell us about whether or not carbon has a locus on some of the things which are really driving what people spend their money on, and what do we want to achieve? And then you think about our specific kind of strategies and processes. What are we trying to do? What options have we got here? And then to think about, okay, so how are we going to know? And really importantly, do we have a very clear link between outcomes in the short term and the long term and the specific actions that we're seeking to take? Can we kind of hardwire those in a way which we don't usually do in our kind of appraisal systems in this country? We usually assume a link between a set of economic and social kind of outcomes and individual people. Can we make it a bit tighter in this case? Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about prioritizing things, we wanted to be really clear about the things that carbon could do and the impacts that they might have. So this is a fairly simple sort of approach conceptually. You'll see we looked at, is an action within Karbon Homes' remit? Is it something that they can do? And then we looked at, okay, if increasing residual household income is the thing that we're trying to do here, and we've identified the different component parts of residual household income and the analysis I talked about a minute ago, can we understand the impact that this potential action or intervention has on increasing those aspects of household income that we're most interested in? So is it within our remit? Yes or no? is it going to have is it going to make a difference to the precise bit of the problem that we've identified? Yes or no? And if you think about it, what that tells you when you start plotting things out is there are some things in the bottom left-hand corner which are going to be very context dependent. Anything we do, anything we argue for is going to be really kind of out with our control. And then there'll be some things which might be high impact, but which are really out with our remit. So we can advocate for them, we can encourage others to act, but we should be clear that we've got a limited kind of direct control over outcomes and activity in that place. And then there'll be some things which are very much within our remit, but we're not certain about the impact. So there's potential to do something there, and they may have wider community benefits. We're not saying that they're not good things to do in and of themselves. We're saying that we're uncertain about their impact on this precise aspect of residual household income. And then the green box would be where you'd hope to find those things which both have a strong rationale because they're clear, they're within our remit, they're things we can do, and they're also things that are going to have an impact on this particular aspect of residual household income. Next slide, please. And so I'm not going to go through all these in great detail. We through the work we did with stakeholders, the consultation, the engagement, talking to Karbon, talking to the community, we identified a whole set of things which could be done, and then prioritised them. And you'll see that there are some very immediate things that emerge into the things that we could do and which look like they could have an impact around energy efficiency of homes, around driving demand in the housing market, around creating jobs and training opportunities, and around stimulating the local business base. And if you think about what a housing association like Karbon does as an anchor institution in a place like this, and there are significant kind of aspects around kind of supply chain activity and local kind of small scale business investment and things, which actually makes quite a significant difference. So there are some quite specific things that kind of jump out. And then it's quite easy to think. It also helps you identify some of those things which you kind of know you're going to need to do, which you want to do for wider community kind of benefit around public realm, also around some of the kind of social support services, because you have so much contact with residents, but which are not going to necessarily have as much of a direct impact on actual residual household income. So next slide, please. And finally, I wanted to say we then kind of took this a step further, because Charlotte and colleagues were really clear that they didn't just want a list of things that they could do, indeed things they could do that might make a difference. They really wanted to understand what does that mean in terms of actual intervention and action, and then how are we going to know, and can we come up with a set of outcome measures which are measurable right from the start. So I'm not going to go through this table in detail, but what it does is to really start with some of the potential actions that I just outlined on the left around energy efficiency, jobs, and the kind of business base, and then work through a series of actual interventions. So can we invest in retrofit for carbon properties? Can we think about letting policies, for example? Can we really think about how we as an anchor institution open up some of those kind of trading opportunities? And then we work through a series of kind of short, medium outcomes, which are measurable, are things which residents themselves would recognise as being kind of measurable, and see happening kind of in the community, through to some longer term kind of outcomes too. And then what Charlotte and Kay did, and what Charlotte now and what she's going to talk about next, is what they kind of then did with that and how they took that into the community and the delivery kind of systems that Karbon are running. Charlotte, over to you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Next slide, please. So Patrick's slide just now we've got a number of other slides like that. So there were a number of different potential interventions that the report identified. So our next task from there was to identify what we were actually going to do. The starting point for this was to building on our consultation and engagement, and we put in place really quite a broad programme of consultation and engagement activity across multiple channels. Notably, it included stakeholder engagement and interviews. One of the things that I've not mentioned is that in parallel with the work on Stanley, it just so happened that Durham County Council were developing a master plan piece of work in relation to the town, and that included quite a lot of consultation with residents within the area about what was working and what wasn't. So that provided an additional evidence base for us at the time, but it also provided quite a useful focus for us to be able to have conversations with Durham County Council and local councillors about what their priorities were and where specifically they thought carbon could have an impact. We obviously also consulted with our customers. That was remotely via surveys, but also via some physical focus groups. And some of those included not only customers, but others who were not our customers, but who lived within Stanley area. And then carbon colleague workshops. And these were workshops with colleagues from across the breadth of carbon. So on the whole, we're not structured at all around place. People are structured in relation to their job roles. That included to a certain extent housing, although we're restructuring our housing team at the moment so that we've got a stronger place-based focus within our housing officers, which I think will help support our place programme. But at the time of doing this work, that was less the case than it is now. So the Carbon Colleagues workshops included housing officers. We have an in-house direct workforce, so it included people from our repairs teams, so maybe joiners or electricians or plumbers who work on our homes within the Stanley area. Included people within my development team who are responsible for development of new homes within that area. People who work on strategic asset management, and then people from specialised teams, so maybe people who work on community funding teams, or who work specifically on antisocial behaviour, or providing those who provide money matters or benefit support to our customers. And I think the other important or significant thing to say about those workshops with colleagues is that in many cases, colleagues were wearing two hats. So not only did their job have some sort of relevancy to the Stanley area, but actually many of them were actually Stanley residents themselves, or maybe grew up or went to school in Stanley when they were younger. So they're people with a really deep ingrained knowledge professionally, but also in many cases personally, of Stanley area. Next slide, please. And from that consultation engagement, we were able to get a sense of stakeholders and colleagues and customers' idea around their prioritisation of activities and interventions that we can take. Interestingly, refurbishing derelict buildings in Stanley came out at top, and I think that that's probably significant because most of you probably won't know Stanley, but if you were to think of maybe a declining high street that you know, it often has a significance beyond the immediate sort of economic impact that decline has, but it takes on a wider emblematic significance for the local community as well. And you'll often see there a real disjuncture between particularly in communities like Stanley, which tend to be quite close-knit and have quite a strong and proud history. There's a disjuncture between that strong and proud history and how they currently feel about that place, as is manifested through, physical decline of buildings on the high street that they see on a daily basis. So I think that is part of the reason that has come out so highly, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Through to the lowest priority was fund more local community groups and charities, and a whole range of other interventions in between. What we then did, next slide please, is we took all of that information, so the research carried out by Metro Dynamics, our own understanding, the prioritisation that came out of our consultation and engagement. We've developed an action plan, which is a piece of work that's in progress. But what I wanted to talk you through now was a range of the interventions that we're currently taking or imminently are intending to take forward within the Stanley area, with a view to improving the economic sustainability and ultimately increasing residual household income in the area. So starting on the left-hand side, we've got some activities targeted most specifically around boosting residual household income. Clearly, the strongest role that we can play in that respect is ensuring the own affordability of our rents. Prior to each annual rent increase, we carefully map the affordability of rents to our customers On the whole, within the Stanley area, actually rents are very affordable, but that obviously becomes increasingly challenging with the introduction of new developments and affordable rents. So what we have also done is put in place, or we're developing at the moment, a method to measure the true affordability, small a, of capital A affordable rents, with a view to putting an affordability filter over the rents that we would be charging in areas to ensure that they remain within the reach of the communities that we're seeking to tailor them for. Obviously, as a significant employer, we also have a very direct impact on residual household income through our employment practices. So to that end, we are committed to paying a real living wage for all roles within Karbon. And as I said, we have a direct workforce, so we don't outsource to third parties. And we also do not make use of any 0 hours contracts. So we seek to be an ethical employer. For having said that, we're only ever going to be able to reach a small proportion of the Stanley customer base via employing them directly or housing them ourselves. And employment, underemployment and unemployment is one of the next biggest driver of residual household income levels in the area. As I said, prior to doing this piece of work, we already offered some skills training support, and we offer this from a skills hub that we've developed since just before the start of this place work, but since the incarnation of Karbon sort of 6 or 7 years ago. We renovated, one of our predecessor organisations renovated a derelict building. We used that as a skills hub, and with the place project we've significantly expanded our employment support out of that on the high street. And a really exciting piece of work that we took forward as part of the place work was to pilot an approach to paid work placements. We did this in a consortium. We led a consortium of other housing providers within the North of Tyne area. And through this, we successfully bidded into Community Renewal Fund funding for paid placements that were targeted towards adults who were either long-term unemployed or who were underemployed and wished to change their career. And what these placements, or this scheme, aimed to do was to really broker opportunities for social housing tenants with local businesses, often small local SMEs, to offer them placements that really were tailored towards their interests and skills and strengths, but also took account of limitations that they might have, whether that's sort of maybe disabilities or neurodivergence or caring responsibilities. Because this pilot was sort of so intensive and was targeted towards the hardest to reach sections of the community, it was relatively small scale in nature. So you're looking at around 70 placements, but it was really successful. And so we've got some brilliant case studies. So one of my favourites is a guy who literally hadn't had a job since 1988. He successfully completed a placement, and he was offered a full-time permanent, sorry, not full-time because I didn't suit him, but a permanent role within his employer, and he's now one of their star employees. And actually the percentage of placement participants that are now in permanent employment or education and training with a view to moving into it was extremely high. My last point of checking, it was over 70%. The funding for that has stopped, but what we've done is we've continued to fund placements both within Karbon, but also fund some placements that we've brokered with local businesses. And we're looking at how we might be able to scale up this model by tapping into private sector investment as well. On the homes front, heating costs are obviously an important impact on residual household income, but we also know that the sort of environmental quality of the home has a very impact on other aspects of people's health and well-being and ability to work. So we're prioritising a lot of our decarbonisation funding on the worst performing homes within the Stanley area. And one of the things that we've not yet done, but I'm interested in doing moving forward, is I think that there's a real win-win opportunity in the North East, as there is probably elsewhere across the UK, in joining up or taking advantage of the decarbonisation sort of challenge and agenda, and using it to tie in with SME development and skills and apprenticeship training as well. I think that that's a really fruitful area of investigation there that I'm keen that we look at specifically in Stanley in the North East. Alongside decarbonisation, we've also put in place a new furniture provision programme, and that provides low-cost furniture packs to families or individuals who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford the basics like beds, white goods, etc. On moving into a home. And we've started to expand that, and we're currently piloting a flooring pilot. You're probably aware that it isn't currently standard practice within the social housing sector to provide flooring to new tenants, and that can have a significant detrimental impact on their heating costs, quality of life, and also the livability of their home. So we're piloting an approach where when low wage customers move into a property within the Stanley area, we will now be providing them with flooring in situ. Childcare has already come up in the chat. In looking at residual household income and employment patterns, it became obvious that one of the significant barriers to greater levels of employment was childcare costs, and we've piloted a couple of approaches towards out-of-hours childcare, but we're also looking at other support that we might be able to provide to young people to help them get more employment ready. And finally, as I said, place, regeneration of derelict buildings, as I said previously, came up top in the ranking of priorities from our consultees. And so to that end, one of the things that we have actually done is, while we were taking forward this piece of work, well, actually, the thing that stimulated this piece of work a couple of years back was the local council, Durham Council, approached us and asked us whether or not we would be interested in buying the old board school building on the High Street within Stanley. That place, we were theoretically interested, but we didn't really know what we might be able to do with it in order to have a tangible and lasting impact on Stanley to justify the cost. And it was that conundrum that actually kicked off this piece of work in the first place. Very recently, we completed the purchase of the school board building. So as of, I think it was the end of February, we now own that building. Of all of the derelict buildings within Stanley, it's probably the one that is most iconic. And we're currently consulting with customers and the local community on the best use for that building. It's currently a target for ASB, and we're talking with the local community about what use is going to have the biggest impact on helping to revitalise and turn round the potential within the high street. Alongside that, we've got a garage replacement programme. Many of our garages are either derelict or underused, and we're either replacing those with green amenity space or new homes. For the new homes, we piloted an innovative MMC approach called Husk. It's since been rolled out elsewhere, and that looks at essentially dropping in modular units onto old garage sites. And then finally, as Patrick said, we're conscious of the fact that we're a local procurer, a significant local procurer, not only in retrofit, but in a number of other ways as well. And we're thinking about how we might be able to tap into or gain greater social value from our procurement. Specifically, we've recently applied for some funding to look at how we might be able to lead an approach towards procurement that builds on things like the Preston model or the Durham pound, but actually helps to prioritise firms that are going to more directly help support and build the residual household income locally and strengthen the foundation economy locally. So those are some of the actions that we're taking. If you could go to the next slide, please. As I said, it's a work in progress, so we're continuing to identify further actions to take. And I wanted to finalise by just saying a little about our Fair Foundation's report. So the work by Metro Dynamics was the first in several pieces of work that then went in to inform our Fair Foundation's approach. The sort of ethos behind the report is that everyone deserves a fair chance to realise their potential wherever they live. And I think it's probably fair to say that the Fair Foundation's report and approach is two things. So firstly, it's a new approach to evaluating places and interventions, which is based on the concept of the foundational economy. And that sets out a conceptual approach along the lines and building on some of the work that Patrick has outlined. But we've also designed it as an approach or a coalition, so a coalition of acting and willing and like-minded partners who are interested in working together to share best practice and learn together to help to understand how better we might all be able to tackle the challenges of left behind places. And to that end, the Northern Housing Consortium has convened and is acting as secretariat to a network of housing associations and local authorities that operate within the North who are interested in sort of sharing best practice on place-based interventions that play particularly strongly to a foundational economy approach. So that's, I think that's it from Patrick and I will hand back over to Jack, who I think is going to convene the questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you both for taking us through those slides there. Let's have a look, go through some of these questions. Then I was particularly kind of interested in the part when you were talking about kind of the retrofit part, talking about supporting and working with SMEs and offering of greater apprenticeships, given that we know that one of the significant kind of challenges and barriers to the retrofitting of the housing stock that we have in this country is skills and capacity to deliver on some of that. So I'd be interested to hear more about that in the future. So the first question that we have on the list, and this one might be for yourself, Charlotte, but please do feel free to jump into any questions if you want to add anything else on, Patrick, is what does the focus of the two carbon impact areas, Biker and Stanley, mean for other places carbon works in, and when will you work in the new impact areas? Sorry, is a two-parter. The second part of that is the challenge for the organisation and relationship with stakeholders?
So what we've said is that we will identify a new impact area every other year. So currently we've got two. Stanley was the first, Biker is the second. Next year we will look at identifying a third. We'll learn as we go that the current intention is to continue to roll out from there. The way that we choose those impact areas is if you think about it, you can plot everywhere that carbon works on a matrix that's got the concentration of homes on one axis and level of need on another, and you're really looking for the sweet spot. So those places that both have quite a high level of need, so you'd see that through scoring lowly on and see of multiple deprivation, with also a high level of concentration of homes. Now that doesn't exclude rural areas because it's concentration rather than absolute number that matters. And it may be that you look at an estate, so Biker is an estate or a town or a village. That immediately means that actually you can only carry out this sort of intervention in a relatively small number of places, because although there are a number of areas with need, we wouldn't necessarily have a high concentration. We have high concentrations in areas that aren't really suffering very significant market failure, or where carbon's sort of further intervention is not going to make that much of a difference. The other criteria that I should add is that we also look at whether or not how receptive local stakeholders would be for carbon to play that role. It sounds a little bit like a no-brainer, but actually we found that isn't the case everywhere. And so that has already determined some places that we haven't chosen to work in. In terms of what it means for our customers and stakeholders living in other areas, we do take a place-based approach everywhere. So we, as part of the tenant satisfaction measures, we measure in sort of all of our homes, how all of our households perceive the role that we play in helping to provide a good quality place. And we would always have an eye to that in terms of the quality of our existing home and immediate sort of public realm over which we've got control. We also offer services like benefit support and some employment services everywhere. But in carbon impact areas, the support is more intensive, and we would tend to pilot things in those areas first, as well as looking at buying derelict buildings in those areas, whereas we wouldn't look at doing that elsewhere. We've articulated this approach quite widely, and so far it's not been challenged by stakeholders at all. But I think that there's an interesting question behind that.
That's great. Thank you very much. As part of that question, you mentioned the tenant satisfaction measures and some of the other things that you kind of look at as part of those activities. So that kind of leads us on to the next question quite nicely, which is, how does Karbon measure the success and impact of its interventions? If you could kind of try and give an overview of that.
Yeah. So ideally, we would, in its purest term, we're doing something because we want it to boost residual household income. So to that end, you would really want to be able to measure that through, are we boosting residual household income in that area? That said, the problem with that is it's difficult to measure residual household income, often at the level at which we've got a carbon impact area, and it's also really difficult to measure attribution. So residual household income is more likely to go up or down due to things well beyond carbon's control, in particular things like changes in taxation and benefits policies. So to that end, what we've decided to do currently is to measure our success through things like universal measures, such as customer satisfaction with the difference that carbon makes to the quality of place, but primarily through measuring the impact of individual interventions, and the measurement technique would vary between different interventions. So for instance, for the job placements, we would be looking to measure job success and longevity post the placement period, whereas for something like a flooring pilot, we would be looking at perception measures, but also things like tenancy sustainment. So it's really about identifying the most appropriate measures for individual interventions. That's a compromise approach. Ideally we would have a more direct way of measuring the success of the pilots overall, and that remains a work in process, and it's something that I'm continuing to discuss with Patrick and other sort of partners that we're working on, whether or not it's possible to develop a better sort of all-encompassing measurement methodology.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you very much. This one will be more for yourself, Patrick, or again, please feel free to add into it. I've had a question in the chat asking about whether or not the measure of residual income is equivalized and does account for childcare costs. I know throughout that session a few times, Charlotte, you'd kind of touched on the childcare costs element of that, but just to kind of cover the basis and the face off that question as well, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, Patrick, about whether or not that had been equivalized, and anything else you wanted to kind of add on to that, just to address the question.
Yeah, thanks. No, as we said, it doesn't include childcare costs, and I don't think we have equivalentized it. No, but I'd be interested to know a little bit more about what's behind the question. See what I mean? So what? Yeah, which and either it's really happy to do that offline or now if someone wants to kind of chip in a bit more. I wasn't quite sure what was behind it in terms of what you were after, what you were driving at, really.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Probably just me. It's probably just me being thick. So
I'll keep an eye on the chat. If we see anything come through on that, then please do feel free to raise that, and we'll try and pick it up on this. But otherwise, maybe want to resolve afterwards. The next question is, how is your commitment to place as an anchor institution factored into asset management strategy and commercial decisions, re the viability of stock?
Okay, because carbon impact areas are always areas where we've got a high concentration of homes, the decisions about where you've got a tension between the potential commercial viability of a home and whether to dispose or not are less acute in any case, because we've got a default approach whereby if we have got a large amount of stock in an area, even if that stock is not performing optimally, and there is no way to make it perform financially optimally, we would be adverse to disposing on it because we think that would be likely to have a detrimental impact on a place. And basically, it's for that reason that we're so keen on additional funding for retrofit and regeneration, because in many cases that leaves you with homes that, you know, the commitments place means that you should continue to run, but you're always going to be running them effectively at a loss over 30 years, and or they represent homes that no longer meet the aspirations of current way of living. I think the other way that the place approach would factor in would be, you know, doing something like buying the Stanley board school isn't something that we would do it's somewhere other than a carbon impact area. Again, it's something that is likely to take an investment of money rather than something that would generate a commercial return. But our view is that our presence in the town is such that where you have got an instance where literally no one else would come in and do anything with it and it would continue to decline, then we feel that we've got, you know, there is a business case for us to use some of our profit from commercial development, from the more commercial end of our development programme to cross-subsidise activities.
Thank you. The next question is, as an anchor institution, what barriers, if any, do you experience that you feel kind of stifles your ability to deliver the impactful interventions that you kind of seek to do in an area? And adding on to that, if there are any, what do you feel could help kind of unlock some of those barriers?
So I think I've probably mentioned the main one, which is receptiveness of local stakeholders, particularly actually local authorities. Potentially there's something around the sort of the environment in which you're working, and so in particular sort of the extent to which local partners have the local powers that they need. So I think devolution will help that significantly. And then I think another aspect of that would be how easy and receptive other anchor institutions in an area would be to work with you. Beyond that, I would probably say that actually some of the things that make the biggest impact to the success of an area or what we're able to do are actually sort of local, but probably to a great extent national government policies. So one of the things that I've not talked about as part of this work is that actually the third element of the Fair Foundation's work is actually it's a lobbying piece of work. So specifically, you know, it looks at what changes we would want to see from local government to help support places like these, and in particular things like, you know, changes in the tax and benefit system or improvements in public transport, because alongside childcare, we know that they are both the other two most significant barriers to people in left behind areas moving into employment or increasing their rate of employment.
Thank you. The next question is following on from your mention of the flooring pilot. So we've been asked, are you thinking of retaining good quality flooring and window coverings in the properties and gifting them to incoming customers at the time of reletting? Historically, all finished floorings and window coverings are removed from a property regardless of quality when a customer moves out and the property becomes void.
I don't know the answer to that question for window coverings, so curtains and blinds and so forth. For flooring, yes, that is actually what we're looking at through the pilot. So the pilot specifically looks at doing two things. So what it does is you go in, evaluate the quality of the flooring. If there is existing flooring in already that is of a good enough quality, we will leave it in. If there isn't, we will look at putting in flooring, and we're piloting what the costs and impact of that is. And depending on what the results of that pilot are, we would then look at rolling that out. Now, having said that, I know that the provision of flooring is mooted as one of the potential things that might come with decent homes too. But as I said, we're slightly ahead of the curve on that at the moment, in that we're currently piloting that in Stanley.
That's great, thank you. The next question is, would you be able to provide an example, or is there any resources that you could suggest people look towards for examples of how you use the Fair Foundation's approach in evaluation, as you mentioned before?
I so when you're saying evaluation, I'm assuming the question is in evaluating what we should be doing. At the moment, I think that probably the best published thing that we have is our Fair Foundations report. But what we were looking to do is to do a follow-up report to that might include, which would include some examples of case studies of interventions that we have taken forward and other organisations who are doing similar things have taken forward, that chimes well with this approach. So I think that's probably where I would point you to currently, but as I said, that will be forthcoming.
That's great, thank you. That I think it covers kind of like the evaluation of where those interventions kind of do come in. The next question is about perhaps the ongoing monitoring. So are you undertaking any long-term monitoring of the impact areas to assess effectiveness of the interventions that have been delivered?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to the first answer that I gave, really. Yes, we will, albeit sort of, measurement and attribution remains really tricky. So, but yes, because the intention is that we make a long-term difference to the economic sustainability of the place.
That's great, thank you. I think that brings the questions that have been provided with to an end on there. So yes, what I'll do then is return us to the slides, if you would mind popping them back up, and I'll take us through the last few ones, just to go through our take-home messages and a little bit of the further information and takeaways from this. So firstly, there we go. So yeah, that brings us to the end of the Q&A segment. Just before I move on, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to both of our speakers and presenters for today's session, and everybody in the background at Metro Dynamics and Karbon Homes who have helped in the setup and delivery of this session. Just to mention as well, I'll not go through what's on the slide at the minute point by point, but we have pulled together a slide to help summarize some of the key take-home messages from today's session. But just to keep an eye out for the Housing Information Hub in the future, coming out soon. I'll give it a few seconds just to flash up the information on the screen there. And then, yeah, what I'll do is I'll run through the closing. So if we can take us on to the next slide, that brings us to the end of today's session, introducing the Fair Foundations approach. Just to mention again, big thank you to our presenters and everybody who's been able to attend, and those who have helped run the session from behind the scenes in the background. We hope that you've enjoyed the slide today and enjoy the remainder of your day. But yeah, thank you for attending, and goodbye for now. Look forward to the next one.